Edvard Grieg is Norway's musical son, a towering figure enshrined in Norwegian history and nationalism, but admired throughout the world of classical music.
Welcome to episode number 3 of Musical Footprints, the stories behind the greatest composers of classical music.
I'm Paul Vergelderop in Eindhoven, the Netherlands.
And I'm Steve Moretti in Ottawa, Canada. So, Paul, how are things on your side of the Atlantic?
Well, they're pretty good, Steve. We're definitely in autumn now. We've got starting to get some frost, lots of leaves turning, and a lot of wind and rain as well. But that's part of it. But I have to say, I kind of like it. Apart from that, just been busy working. How about you?
Very similar. Our clocks go back in a week or two. You're already back, I know. So we're 1 hour closer together now. So interesting.
Yes, we
Yeah,
are.
we've got lots of leaves turning and the fall. And I think that's my favorite time of year. There's just something energetic about it that I like. I'm busy working on book 3 of my Song for Lost Kingdom series, and the book has a lot more music, and the two main characters communicate through time using music. So Paul and I are going to be working together on some how that could possibly be. So that's a fun thing that I'm doing at the moment, and I'm really getting into it at the moment.
So, who do we have on the table today?
Edvard Grieg, who I didn't really know much about, but I think you're a big fan of him.
I am, yeah. I really always enjoyed his music. I think I first got to know it through an old video game, actually called Day of the Tentacle, which
Really?
included a
Wow.
yeah, and it includes a really funny intro to the game, which features Grieg's music, one of his most famous pieces, the Morgenstimmung from the Peer Gynt suite. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But you never heard of him?
You know what? Now that I'm doing the research, I know his music, but I didn't really know the name for some reason. It's just, I don't know, just escaped me. But yeah, when I started listening to some of the pieces and things, I thought, oh yeah, I know that. I know that music. I just, for some reason, I thought it was, I had no idea it was him. But anyways,
Well, we're going to learn a little bit more about him today.
yeah. And so to start off a little bit about his roots, and it's interesting because my book is set in Scotland, at least the part in the past. And the Battle of Culloden is sort of the climax of book 2, and I spent pretty much a year researching that battle, which was a very climatic event in the history of Scotland. And it turns out that Grieg's grandfather was, I don't know if he fought in that battle, but pretty much soon after the Battle of Culloden, he he left Scotland, and their family is actually uh, their family name is Gregere, which is from MacGregor or Gregor in Scotland. And Roy MacGregor, Rob Roy, who some of you might have heard of, was one of the most famous members of that clan. And Grieg's grandfather traveled around and settled in Norway about 73 years before Edvard was born. And he went to Bergen, which was the largest town in Norway, but there's only about 14,000 people at that point. Today, there's probably a quarter of a million or more. Um, And at that point, it was ruled by a Swedish king, and we'll talk a little bit about Sweden and Denmark and all that kind of stuff. And it was a very strong sense of nationalism growing in Norway when Edward was born in 1843, and that's really influenced him greatly throughout his life. And eventually, he would become probably one of the most famous Norwegians ever, and kind of like the Shakespeare of Norway is the way he's described in a lot of work.
He got his musical education at home from his mother, who taught him a lot of different pieces on the piano, like Chopin, Weber, Mendelssohn, a lot of German composers. And actually, his first composition was called "The Variations of a German Melody for Piano," and he took it with him to school, and he was punished for it. The manuscript was
Really?
burned. Yeah, that
Wow.
was not, that was not the best start for one of the greatest
No,
composers
that
in,
might
in
be a little
history.
discouraging.
Yeah, that wasn't too
Yeah.
good, but it wasn't really well received. So he got punished, and a manuscript got burned. So he got off of a bit of a rocky start, I'd say. So his musical education started at home, as it did for so many others, but didn't stay there. He went to the Conservatory of Leipzig at a later age, but that didn't go. Um, that didn't go very naturally. He had a little bit of help with that. I think you can tell us a little bit about with a bit.
Well, yeah, there was a violinist, Norwegian violinist. He was the equivalent of Niccolo Paganini, who was our subject of our last couple
Oh, really?
episodes. He was a violin, yeah, virtuoso, and but he was about 30 years older than Edvard. He was born in the same city and apparently started playing violin at the age of 4. And he was very caught up with this whole idea of Norwegian nationalism. Really didn't want to be governed by the king of Sweden, and he ran a theater, and his actors were trained to speak Norwegian rather than Danish. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences. They're very, very close, but it would be the equivalent of someone speaking with American versus British, or
Mm.
Scottish versus Australian or something. So it's a very similar language. And he was a friend of the Grieg family. His brother was actually married to Edvard's aunt, and apparently one day he was visiting them, and Edvard was playing on the piano. I don't know if this was before or after his script was burned, but he listened to him, and he said to the parents, "You have to send him for formal education, for formal music training." And he recommended the conservatory in Germany, the Lipsing one. He was only 15 at that time, but apparently he was quite enthusiastic to at least give it a try. Maybe he wanted to
Mm.
get out of Bergen and get away from all the bullying. I'm not sure, but it seemed to be Ole really had a big, influence in helping him make that jump.
Mm. I got a short example from all this work. I've never heard of the name. I'd never heard of the name before we started kind of researching for this podcast. But I find one piece which is supposedly a pretty well known piece by him. I'm not quite sure if I'm going to be able to pronounce it correctly. I'm going to give it a try.
Oh, come on, Paul, you can do it.
I'm gonna give it a try, but I am not a Norwegian. Seterjenta Sundak. It's a piece written for various vocal parts, and it goes a little bit something like this. I think it's interesting that if you listen to this, you can actually hear some of the it's kind of like the folkloristic influences. But that by that I mean is that the piece itself it's relatively simple. So is the melody, but it has a lot of balance. It's also something that could easily be sung by an amateur choir, and we'll
Mhm.
see throughout this episode that that sort of structure, that sort of balance, but also that that simplicity was something that was really influential on Grieg's work throughout his life.
Interesting. And just one thing I found about the difference between Danish versus Norwegian, and Ole insisted that they speak Norwegian rather than Danish. And so to Danish people, when Norwegians speak, it's like they're singing. I don't know if that sounded quite like what the piece we heard, but they have this sing to their voice, or song to their voice, or a melodic kind of way of delivery. Whereas Norwegians, when they hear Danish people speak, they describe it as sounds like they're chewing potatoes. So there's this distinctiveness between them, and it wouldn't be unlike in English. As someone in the America listening to someone in Scotland speak, it's the same language. It sounds pretty similar, but there's a very different quality to the way it's delivered and spoken, and and some words are different as well. So it's that kind of um, that could drive a kind of a nationalistic. kind of sensibility, I guess. And in listening to that piece, I could almost imagine the influence that might have if that's delivered in more of a Norwegian dialect than a Danish dialect.
Mhm.
So we move on to lip sync, and I guess that was a kind of a momentous period of his life. And just a little bit of background on that conservatory. It was actually started in 1843, the same year that Edvard was born, by a guy named Felix Mendelssohn. And I
Mm.
don't know, maybe at some point we'll be covering him.
Yeah, very
And
likely.
yes, and Lipsing, Germany, is where Johann Sebastian Bach was from, and his son Johann Christian also lived there.
Mhm.
And it's also the home of Wagner and Schumann and a few others. And apparently, Ludwig Beethoven liked to kind of hang out and lip sync some occasionally and try out some of his new works there. So a lot of them were premiered there. But interesting, and what I just read, I think yesterday about Edvard, when what he thought about the conservatory, where he did learn a lot, to be fair, and I think that's where he really um, developed more of his professional skills. He said that when he left the conservatory, he was as stupid as when he entered it. So uh, I think that was kind of his attitude about a lot of things, even though I think he did benefit from it.
Yeah, he absolutely did. I had a little look at his a little bit of information about his education there, and he had a little bit of a problem with the discipline of the program. He also had a little bit of difficulty with having to learn to play and also compose by the rules. Music theory has a lot of rules, and you kind of have to learn them before you're allowed to break them. And that was
Right,
also
exactly.
something
That's very
that
similar to a lot of things.
yeah, and that was something that he had to start with because he had never had any formal education in music theory. So for him, that was he really had to get used to all that. He also had to get used to writing larger pieces, which he wasn't particularly good at. He was actually a lot better at writing shorter musical forms with a simple structure. But if you're going to study at the Leipzig Conservatory, you're going to have to write symphonies and that sort of forms as well. One of the things that he
Mhm.
did like, though, was playing the organ. And not surprisingly, as Bach is already, is from the same region and even the same city apparently at that time. One of the things that he would have played, and I want to uh, play an example of that. Bach was well known for writing a lot of theoretically very interesting and complex pieces. And he wrote a lot of fugues, which is a certain form of piece for the organ. So it is very likely that he played a lot of those, both because they're written for the organ, but also because they're very interesting from a theoretical point of view. So, for example, this is one of the fugues for organ by Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach is, until this day, considered to be the absolute master of what is known in musical theory as counterpoint. And counterpoint originally comes from the term punctus contra punctum, which means note against note. And it is a part of musical theory that describes on how uh, different voices and melodies should interact with each other and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And a lot of the pieces that Bach wrote are still considered to be the absolute highlights of a counterpoint mastery. So young Edward had most likely had to play a lot of those to get a good feeling for it and also develop. that knowledge on counterpoint, which he would later use in life for his own compositions.
So when Edvard, his time at the conservatory was, I think he was learning a lot, but he was never he always had health problems really throughout his life, and while he was there, he had a couple of very difficult experiences, two life threatening diseases actually, pleurisy and tuberculosis. One of them, pleurisy, that's inflammation of your lungs and your chest cavity, and you get really sharp chest pains whenever you breathe, and breathing is bad, but if you cough or if you sneeze, it's really uncomfortable. And if you laugh, and a really deep belly laugh, it can almost feel like you're going to about explode. And if that wasn't bad enough, he also got tuberculosis, which is a contagious disease that affects your lungs. And again, there's a chronic cough, but this time there's blood could be mixed into it, so it's pretty dangerous. And around that time was about 1860. A lot of people died from tuberculosis, but somehow Edvard survived both of these, although his left lung was pretty much destroyed and part of his spine deformed. And the only way he could actually kind of get through this was to go to spas and sanatoria and that kind of things. And he ended up spending a lot of time with doctors who became his friends, and that continued more or less for the rest of his life. So he really struggled, and it's you know you think of kind of trial by fire. He's uh, at the conservatory, you know, probably the first time they say he's been doing formal education of music, and he's got these pretty horrendous diseases that he's struggling with at the same time. So I imagine it was a pretty trying point of his life as a young teenager or as a young man.
Yeah, it also explains his choices later in life on where he lived and what kind of conditions he lived in. After graduation, Grieg he moved to Copenhagen, capital of Denmark, which is nice. I've been there myself. It's a really nice city, and he met with Richard Noordrak, who is a Norwegian composer. Unfortunately, died very young. I believe he was actually still in his 20s or 30s when he passed away. And he is most well known for composing the Norwegian national anthem. So they met there, and I believe, and I think you can tell us a little bit more about that, Steve, that that meeting of two souls was very important to Greek throughout his life and kind of sparked a lot of that nationalism.
They were friends, and I know that when he did die, Greg was Edward was very affected by that, and I think he ended up writing the funeral march in his honor. And he also, sadly to say, that he knew that he was in bad shape. Ricard was in bad shape, and as good of friends as they were, uh, Edvard was actually traveling a lot and maybe should have stayed with him a little bit more than he did. But what they were obsessed with more than anything was really about Norway, about the country that they lived in. And Norway has a long history of basically not being Norway. It's struggled to be an independent country. There are some people that you probably have heard of, Eric the Red and Leif Erikson. They were pretty famous Vikings, and Eric discovered Iceland, and his son went a little further west and found Newfoundland. That was around the year 1000, and the Vikings, they pretty much ruled Norway from about that time until the Middle Ages, and life was not too bad. Everybody had owned their own land, except for the plague and the Black Death. That wasn't so good, and about half the population got wiped out at that time. And eventually, Christianity took over from the Norse mythology and the Viking religion. But what happened was Norway was essentially Denmark's Norway, so it was kind of subjugated a bit to Denmark, and the Danes kind of imposed their language on the Norwegian. It was the Danish language, but again, as we've talked about, it was the Norwegians retained a kind of a sense of their own identity through a slight variation of the language. And then in so in the beginning of the 1800s, when uh, before Edvard was born, Denmark lost Norway to Sweden, And so they went from being,
How did they
part of Denmark to
how
now
did they
being,
lose it? Did they play
I
cards
don't
and
know. I think there was a there.
how does
Yeah, no, there was some. Without getting into it, there was a basically a war, and it ended up that Denmark had to give up Norway as part of the settlement. But they were allowed to choose a king, and they chose a Danish king. So I mean, it gets even more complicated and interesting. So they had a kind of convention in the early 1800s, and one of the people that got to vote was Edvard Hagerup, and he's actually Edvard's Grieg's grandfather. But more interesting, he's also the grandfather of Nina Hagerup, who Edvard would end up marrying. So it's all very incestuous, but that's kind of the way things went. And so when Edward was born in 1843, Norwegians and Norway in general just wanted to get out. They wanted to be independent from Sweden, and they did have their own government. They were kind of autonomous, but officially they were not their own country. And so everything sort of Norwegian, their history, their distinct language, their geography, became very important to people like Grieg and to Nordrak and that kind of thing. But interesting, it wasn't until 1905 when they became independent. So Edward died in 1905. Sorry, he died in 1906, and it was actually just the year before that Norway became independent. So it was he lived to see it, but then he quickly died afterwards.
what is interesting to note, during his time in Leipzig, he did get the opportunity to listen to a lot of the present German composers and performances. He was a big fan of Richard Wagner, and he actually went to see Tannhauser, which is a piece by Wagner. He saw it more than 14 times during his study, and he had a lot of admiration for his work and a lot of other German composers. Though in later times, he became really critical of it because he felt that the direction that German composers were going became a lot more bombastic, much more overpowering, and he was not a big fan of that. But one of his first performances of his own work was unfortunately when Richard Nordraak died, and he died really young. So that was a bit tragic to start with.
Yeah, and he died of tuberculosis, which was we did talked about earlier. So it must have been even that much more meaningful to Greg, who actually survived
Yeah, that
the
probably
same
felt really
illness.
close to home. I think he lost someone who was at that point really dear to him. And that's also, I think,
Yeah.
demonstrated by the fact that he wrote the funeral march to Nordraak's funeral. I've actually got a sample of that because it seemed fitting to pick that.
So basically, after that period, he returned to Norway. Finally, he'd been traveling and that kind of thing, and he ended up marrying his first cousin, Nina. And just a little bit of background about her: she was a soprano, and she sang Danish, Norwegian. And it was actually when he was 21 and she was 18, they got secretly engaged. And Nina's mother found out about it, and she wasn't too impressed. And she told her daughter, Edward is nothing, he has nothing, and he writes music that nobody wants to listen to. So she was very wrong, but she wasn't too wild about this arrangement. And when he was, I think they moved to Oslo at one point, and he introduced himself with a concert, performed his own music, and Nina Hagerup, who would be his wife, uh, was there, and it was very, very, very well received. And finally, when he was 21, they got married in Copenhagen just before his 24th birthday. Now, none of their parents were there. I'm not even sure they were invited. And it turns out they were Unitarians, Christians who believe God is one person. There's not the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And interesting, they also believe in the eternal punishment of hell. So they're kind of a distinct sector of some people call them Protestants, and some people say they're not really Protestants, but they were fairly devout. And after Edvard died, Nina continued doing a lot of work in the Unitarian Church. So one interesting thing is that as about a year after they were married, they had a child. It was basically the year after that. And it was in that year that he spent the time in Denmark and he wrote his piano concerto in A minor, which Paul, I think, is going to play and talk about a little bit. And a lot of people thought he would come up with something after that because it was very well received, but he never apparently wrote another one. In terms of Alexandra, their child, she was basically an infant when she died of meningitis, which is an inflammation of the membranes around the brain. And at that point, they didn't think there was any relation to any genetic factors. But just recently, the last 10 years or so, they've actually, there is more evidence that meningitis is actually, in some cases related to genetic factors. So whether it had anything to do with them being first cousins or not isn't really known. But unfortunately, she was an infant when she died. And it was in that period that he came up with, just before she died, his piano concerto in A minor.
Yeah, before I start playing that, the piano concerto in A minor, though it was really well received, is one of the very few larger structure pieces that he wrote. Compared to a lot of composers, he wrote very few large structure pieces like a piano concerto or a symphony, and he did really throughout time focus most on, well, smaller pieces, piano miniatures, morceaux. So this is one of the few large structure pieces that he ever composed.
So it seems that at this point in his life, Edvard's music was becoming widely known beyond Norway, and Franz Liszt actually, I guess, either heard him or was aware of his music. And at this point, Edvard was trying to tour and to get outside of Norway, but in those days he wasn't allowed to leave, so he had to apply to for a kind of a visa, and they kept denying him. So he got Franz Liszt to write a testimonial. I don't think it was prompted, actually. I think he just received it, and he used that. He took it to the Ministry of Education, and it still took a year and a half, but eventually uh, Grieg was able to go to Rome, and that's where he met Franz Liszt. And um, apparently, it was February 17th when they actually met, and Liszt was took some of his music and was sight reading it right on the spot. And Greg considered Liszt a kind of there was quite an age difference between the two. Liszt was 58, Edvard was still only like 25, 26 years old. And he kind of looked at Liszt as kind of a someone he would look up to, and anything that he would say, he used it kind of as a sacred mandate. And apparently, Liszt told Edvard to hold on, hold your course. He's got talent, and don't get scared. So the other thing is, it seems like a lot of these guys like to go to Italy, and I'm not surprised. But given the weather potentially in Norway and Germany, um, and then somebody else that went to Italy was Henrik Ibsen, who was one of the most famous playwrights in Norway, second only to Shakespeare in terms of the number of times his plays were performed. But at that point, he was about 37, and he decided voluntarily exiled himself from Norway. and this was about he was about a year or two in Rome, and Edvard, I guess, was in Rome, and they met there, and must have had some kind of influence on him. And Ibsen spent basically 27 years of his life away from Norway. So it's basically in this around 1874, Henrik moved to Dresden and to do some work, and he wrote his 5-act play, which was kind of a dramatic poem, really, fairy tales of Norway, kind of reimagined and all that kind of thing, called Peer Gynt. And he wrote a letter to Edvard and asked him if he could write some incidental music to go with it. And apparently Edvard was ready and willing to do it, although he really struggled to get the work done. And his wife said that Edvard was kind of obsessed with it, and he could see that he was the right person to do it. And but he really had a difficult time uh, coming up with the music. But I think we're all thankful that he did, because in the end, it turned out to be perhaps some of his most memorable and well recognized music.
Yeah, I actually think that the work on the Peer Gynt treatises are definitely the work that he is most well known for. To be fair, when he was writing it, he apparently considered the whole work that Ibsen had written to be very unmusical. So he found it difficult to get inspired by it. Another thing that was a struggle for him, which is something that we talked about a little bit earlier at this time at the Leipzig Conservatory, is that he struggled with writing large structure pieces. It was not his forte. So I can imagine that that combination made it a little bit more difficult to for him to get the work done. But indeed, I think we're all very thankful that he did, because it's definitely the work he is most recognized for. The Pig Institute definitely demonstrates the
Mm.
signature sound that he had developed at that time. We talked about a little bit earlier is that he would write relatively deceptively simple pieces. But when he
Mhm.
originally started playing the piano, for example, he played a lot of Chopin. And Chopin is known in the piano world and music world as someone who used a lot of chromatism. I'm not going to get into too much detail on how that works, but the idea is, for example, if you're playing in a certain key, chromatism refers to the sort of like the technique to start using notes that are not in the original key, and that can create a very surprising effect. It can be really confrontational. But Greek had mastered at that point the art of using chromatism to definitely add surprise and change to the piece, but not in a way that it really kind of explodes in your face. It still has a very natural flow to it. And the music that he wrote for Peer Gynt also demonstrates his ability in his pieces, that he was able to conjure a mood, which we'll notice very much so in the piece that I think everyone has been waiting for who has ever heard anything by Grieg. That is the Peer Gynt Morgenstimmung.
Yeah.
And actually, the scene that is set in is, I believe, Peer Gynt actually wakes up in the Sahara Desert. And it sort of demonstrates on how he wakes up, sees the world around him, sun coming up, etc. But it also has a very strong sense um, of nature. Um, One of the examples that we'll hear in that is at some point that the sun comes up and comes through. You can really feel that and hear that in the music. What he also did quite a lot was imitate sounds of nature through musical instruments. So, for example, he would use trills and other ornamentations in, for example, woodwinds to imitate the sound of birds singing. In later pieces, in the same suite, the Peer Gynt suite, there is a scene where Peer is actually tiptoeing around, and he uses the pizzicato strings, which we talked about quite a bit with in our episodes about Paganini, to imitate that same sound. So I'm going to put on Morgenstimmung, and I have a few things to come back to after we hear that. So that last part, sort of like a climax, would actually be the part where the sun came up in the desert, and you can really sense how well the music illustrates that scenery and what is happening there. Also, and I will play the example again to so people can have a good listen to it. When I refer to chromatism later, it means playing notes and chords, etc., that are not part of the original key. And if you listen to the opening of this piece, he actually does that quite a lot, and you can hear those moments by listening for the chords or changes in harmony that sound a little bit unexpected. So I'm going to play it again. People can see if they can recognize those moments. So did you catch that?
Oh yeah, yeah. I but it was good that you did it twice because I didn't really wasn't paying attention in that same way the first time, but then in hearing it again, you get a much better sense of it. The only thing is when I do hear that music, unfortunately, I think of Bugs Bunny and cartoons and things, and I guess it's a little bit overused, that kind of music, but it must have been something, when it was first premiered.
Absolutely, and it's also the reason why I hesitated for a moment to actually use this piece. But then again, this is without a doubt his most well-known and most famous piece. And yes, it has been used in film and theater and video games because this was actually the music when I first heard it from Dave the Tentacle in the opening of the game. It is so well known. A lot of people may not know that it's by Grieg, but I think everyone has heard this piece quite a few times throughout their lives, if not only from cartoons and other
Yeah,
related.
but, the other interesting thing is hearing it, like, out of a single speaker on your television or something, as compared to seeing the orchestra playing this, that must be completely different experience, I would think, because, I don't think you can represent that, the full texture and impact of it from a recording in a sense, It's just a different kinda oral experience. But apparently when it was premiered, right off the bat, people recognized the kind of genius of this. Although I did find a quote from Griggs after and he wasn't there for the premiere. I don't know, he was busy doing something. But he told somebody that the music reeked of cow turds. So I don't know if he was just being sarcastic or that, but he kind of downplayed the significance of it, which is interesting.
Well, I'm not even 100% sure that reeking of cow turds may be a bad thing because it may also be a reference to the fact that the music
Yeah.
really, it really has a sense of meadows and nature,
Right.
and
Okay.
and nature involves cow turds. So
Yeah,
maybe that's what
exactly.
he meant.
The full experience.
Yeah, absolutely, all of it. Not just the happy birds, also the happy cows.
So, moving forward with our story, when he's about 42, Edward and Nina moved to Troldhogen, which is in Bergen. It's now basically a shrine to all things Grieg. And it was just before this, just before they moved into it, he wrote the Holberg Suite. I don't know. Do we have an example of that? Or
Yeah, we do. I definitely
oh,
got a piece of that.
okay.
So
And just before we get into that, just a little bit about Troldhogen. It's basically if you go to Bergen in Norway, it's basically the most popular tourist attraction there, and it's now they've expanded it. It's an estate, and there's a permanent exhibition of his life in music. And apparently, his original Steinway piano was there too, which he was given as a on his wedding anniversary in 1892, and they still have concerts and things there. So it's something worth visiting if you're in Norway.
So yeah, the Holberg Suite again is one of the few large structure pieces that he composed. I'm not going to say too much about it. I'm just going to play the part of the first movement. Another one of the pieces that he composed very much around that time is something I'm not even gonna try to pronounce it in Norwegian because I really can't. Um, but it is a piece called "Wedding Day at Trollhaugen." He also, yeah, as I said, he composed a lot of piano miniatures, and I would feel really really remiss if I did not play at least one more of those. This was one that he supposedly composed for his wife. It is called "I Love You," so you know
That
its
works.
meaning and it meaning and intention are quite clear from the start. So let me play that one.
That's an interesting piece. It's got a lot of different qualities to it. All at first, it almost sounds like something you'd hear in a club, like a smoky club or something, and the vocals are about to start, and then it kind of morphs into something much more classical and uh, just very captivating. Just listening to some of those last pieces, one thing is his catalog is enormous. When you just if you Google it and you find the list of compositions, it runs uh, for a mini. You have to scroll a lot to get to the bottom of the page. So he was very prolific, and we'll have a link to his compositions on our website. And is that the way you see him, Paul, in terms of just so much to choose from in terms of his output?
Well, to be fair, when you look at the list of compositions, a lot of those are, as I said, are piano miniatures. That, of course, does not diminish the quality of that work in any way. But it's a little bit difficult to compare when you think of someone like like Beethoven, for example, who wrote a lot more larger pieces and longer pieces. I mean, one of the piano miniatures could be about 1 to 2 minutes. So that list contains a lot of miniature pieces. I think his looking back on his life and on his work, I think even though he may not have intended it that way, that the Peer Gynt suite is definitely the most well known, and for good reason, because it is beautiful and amazingly written.
Yeah, which ended up it's interesting because, as part of his legacy, a lot of modern bands like The Who, Electric Light Orchestra, and other bands actually did cover versions, which you wouldn't think of, like, of a, a rock band or a progressive rock band covering classical composers, but they actually incorporated that, uh, either, parts of it at least into some of their works. And so he kinda lives on, that way. And it was also interesting after he died, some people said, initially that his music was kind of old fashioned and that, but a lot of the French composers of the early 20th century said that other than Debussy, who was actually we'll be talking about in our next episode, and Ravel in particular, said there was no composer that he felt closer to in terms of style and affinity. So he did have this kind of influence, which initially I think after he died, people didn't recognize, but I think his fame in some ways grew after after he died. That brings us to the end of episode 3. Thank you for listening to Musical Footprints. Please be sure to visit our website, musicalfootprints.com, for show notes and a list of all the music pieces used on today's episode, and links to other things, including all of the compositions that Edvard Grieg um, uh, produced over his lifetime. This is Stephen Reddy. Thanks for listening.
Until next time, this is Paul Vergelderop signing off with the music of Edvard Grieg.